And Tower, just want to confirm this Air Canada 759. We see some lights on the runway there. Across the runway, can you confirm the clear to land?
Air Canada 759, confirm clear to land, runway 28 right. There is no one on 28 right, flight you.
Okay, Air Canada 759.
Where's this guy going? He's on the taxiway.
Air Canada, go around.
In the go-around, Air Canada 759.
Hello, and thank you for joining me today. Coming up in the news, an Air Canada flight has a near miss with 4 fully loaded airliners on the ground at SFO last week. We'll talk about what saved the day and how that could apply to your flying. And the FAA has just announced they'll be hiring 1,400 new air traffic controllers, but you're going to have to act fast to apply for these jobs. And a man attempts to steal a helicopter at gunpoint from a general aviation airport in Oregon. Plus an update on ATC privatization, including another airline who has emailed their customers asking them to support privatization, and about a government study going on in Canada that would privatize even more aviation assets. Plus, we're going to talk about using the Squelch on radios and intercoms and understanding older audio panels. Plus listener questions and email. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Trescott, and I'm here to share my over 40 years of experience as a licensed pilot, author, and 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year to bring you relevant news and safety tips to help you fly safely. And if you haven't heard our recent 2-hour documentary on ATC privatization, please check it out. It's episode 17. And coming up later this week, a Newsmakers episode where we talk in depth about the Beach Bonanza and the American Bonanza Society. And remember, if you like what you hear on the show, please tell your friends so they can join us each week. All this and much, much more, and the news starts now. From the Mercury News, which is the local newspaper here in San Jose, California, this story came out just as I was finalizing our news lineup for this show. In what they bill as an exclusive story, they say an Air Canada pilot on Friday narrowly avoided a tragic mistake, which would have been landing on the San Francisco International Airport taxiway instead of the runway. Sitting on taxiway Charlie shortly before midnight were 4 fully loaded aircraft, which were awaiting permission to take off, according to the FAA. An air traffic controller sent the Air Canada Airbus 320 on a go-around before they landed safely subsequently. FAA investigators are still trying to determine how close the Air Canada aircraft came to landing and potentially crashing into the 4 aircraft on the ground, but the apparent pilot error already has the aviation industry buzzing. Retired United Airlines Captain Ross Amer, who's a consultant, said, "If it is true, what happened probably came close to the greatest aviation disaster in history." He says, if you could imagine an Airbus colliding with 4 passenger aircraft wide bodies full of fuel and passengers, then you can imagine how horrific this could have been. And I just want to remind our listeners that the greatest accident in aviation history occurred on Tenerife, an island off of Spain, with aircraft that were on the ground, one on the ground taxiing, one taking off. And this could frankly have been a disaster of similar magnitude. Peter Fitzpatrick, an Air Canada spokesman, said Air Canada Flight 759 from Toronto landed normally without incident after it initiated a go-around. He said, "We are still investigating the circumstances and therefore have no additional information to offer." Let's take a listen to the full audio clip from liveatc.net.
Good evening, Air Canada 759 with you. Have my speech visual 28 right.
Canada 759, San Francisco, County 28 right, clear to land, then 2708.
Go on 28 right, Air Canada 759. And Tower, just want to confirm this Air Canada 759. We see some lights on the runway there. Across the runway, can you confirm the clear to land?
Air Canada 759, confirm clear to land, runway 28 right. There is no one on 28 right, flight you.
Okay, Air Canada 759.
Where's this guy going? He's on the taxiway.
Air Canada, go around.
In the go-around, Air Canada 759.
759, looks like we're lined up there. Flight heading 280, climb maintain 3000.
Heading 280, 3000, Air Canada 759.
United 1, Air Canada flew directly over us. Block, this United 1, Air Canada flew directly over us.
Yeah, I saw that, guys. 759, contact NorCal 135.1. We'll catch you in a couple minutes.
35.1, Air Canada 759.
United 1, we're going to get you going here in just.
We're ready.
And Captain Amer also said, they're a sitting duck on the taxiway. They can't go anywhere. And I got to tell you, I have felt just that way when I have been on a taxiway next to an active runway as aircraft are coming into land. I've often thought that if a particular aircraft didn't correct properly and they were to hit me on the taxiway, there would be absolutely nothing I could do to avoid them. So literally, you are sitting ducks when you're on the taxiway and aircraft are landing adjacent to you. But let's talk about what averted this disaster. It was somebody on the ground speaking up and saying that the pilot was lined up for the taxiway. Now, from the tower at San Francisco, those people are going to be a little over a mile away from where this incident happened. Frankly, they would not be able to tell from that distance and that angle that the aircraft was not lined up for the runway. And so really it was incumbent upon somebody on the ground to speak up. Got to tell you, there have been a number of times where I've seen something and I have spoken up. And I also know of well-known incidents in the industry where somebody said something and it averted disaster. So key thing is, if you see something, definitely key that microphone, definitely speak up. Even if you think other people see it, if you're not hearing anything, it may be up to you to help avert disaster. Our next story comes from the FAA news page, and I posted this on my Patreon page last week when it first came out, but this is the first time I've had an opportunity to talk about it. The FAA announced last week that it will be accepting applications for candidates for entry-level air traffic controller positions from July 7th to the 14th. So by the time this comes out, you're going to have only a couple of days to apply if you're interested in doing it. They say that the job vacancy for these highly competitive positions will be available on the federal government official job site, usajobs.gov, and they expect to have 1,400 positions filled. Now, if you're interested in applying, they say that you need to apply prior to the closing date and that all applicants must meet the minimum qualifications. They also say that the applicants will be separated into two pools of candidates. Pool 1 will include graduates of an institution that participate in the Collegiate Training Initiative program, which is essentially colleges that offer air traffic control training, as well as eligible veterans will be included in this pool as well. And pool number 2 would be the general public, folks who have not been to specific air training control courses. And they go on to talk about ATC specialists responsible for the safe, orderly, and expeditious movement of air traffic throughout the nation's airspace, and that trainees will spend their first several months of employment in an intensive training program at the FAA Academy located in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. And there are some other requirements as well. You must be at least under 31 years of age. And of course, you'll still face mandatory retirement at age 56. There are also medical, security, and pre-employment tests. And of course, one must be able to speak English as well. So really awesome jobs for folks that are qualified. If you know of someone who's qualified, get them to usajobs.gov as quickly as possible. From Flying Magazine comes a really bizarre story. The headline, Armed Man Shot and Killed After Failed Helicopter Theft. A flying lesson at Oregon's Hillsboro Airport resulted in a fatal shooting last week after a man attempted to steal a helicopter from an instructor and student. Wearing a thick gray hooded sweatshirt and mask, the unnamed would-be thief reportedly climbed over a barbed wire fence at the airport and forced the instructor and student from the helicopter at gunpoint. Neither was hurt, despite the armed man firing one shot away from the helicopter to scare the student from the aircraft. The helicopter was running, but the gunman was unable to escape because of the quick response from Hillsboro Aero Academy employees who were armed and surrounded the helicopter until Hillsboro police arrived. This, to me, is really a rather interesting part of the story. Apparently, there were multiple employees who had concealed carry permits who ran out to the helicopter with their own guns to stop the gunman. The gunman ran from the helicopter, hopped the fence again, went to a nearby field where he was shot and killed by a police officer. Now, I saw a video interview of a witness who had been spending the day watching planes taking off with his son and wife. And he said, quote, as he goes by us, he looks directly at me and then turns. And as soon as he turns, he pulls the gray mask over his face. He said, as soon as that mask came up, we thought it was strange, looked at each other, that's his wife, and then decided to get our son into the car seat, buckle him up, and go. That's when we actually heard those shots fired. Now, a few days later, the Hillsboro police did release the name of the perpetrator. They said he was 25 years old. that he had no known address at the time, and he had a history of driving infractions in Tumwater in Olympia, Washington. So a rather bizarre story out of Oregon. And to me, this is really unprecedented. I can't remember of anybody, kind of skyjacking an aircraft on the ground but from gunpoint at a GA airport. I suppose it has happened somewhere, but this is exceedingly rare. Turning now to an update on privatization from AOPA, 46 industry groups issue a joint statement following AOPA's call to action. So no surprise, virtually every general aviation group in America has come out against ATC privatization. And I don't know if you received the same email I received from Southwest Airlines last week. It had the subject line, Your Rapid Rewards Report, July 2017. Well, the top of the email was not about my Rapid Rewards program. It started immediately with this paragraph that said, help us advocate for national ATC modernization. Our ATC system is safe, but terribly out of date and increasingly inefficient, resulting in longer flight times and unnecessary delays. Visit, and they gave the name of a website, and tell your representative and senator in Congress to deliver the transformational ATC reform that you deserve. Let your voice be heard. Well, I don't think there's any evidence that it's ATC that's responsible for longer flight times and unnecessary delays. I read yet another story recently that talked about 70-some% of the delays were attributed to the airlines themselves and to weather. And of course, we've talked about the longer flight times in this show. The airlines used to fly much faster aircraft, much fuel-hungrier aircraft back in the 70s and 80s. Of course, the flight times were shorter then because of that. So the airlines are pulling out all the stops to get their customers to go ahead and contact the U.S. Senate and the representatives. So once again, if you haven't done this already, it's really, really, really important that you take the time right now to go out to govt.eaa.org. So that's govt, short for government, .eaa.org. Let your representative and your senators know that you oppose ATC privatization. I also had an email from someone in Canada who said that even Canada is thinking about privatizing national airport system. There are 26 busiest airports in the country. You know from our privatization episode 2 weeks ago that in Australia they've privatized most of the large airports there, and the costs have gone up tremendously as a result. Well, this listener tells me that the Ministers of Finance and Transport in Canada have commissioned Credit Suisse to analyze a project for privatization of the 26 busiest airports. Apparently, Credit Suisse has done that review already, and the Minister of Transport is still studying the question. So, folks in Canada, you might want to be contacting your representatives to let them know that you might not want to have your airports privatized and face the higher costs that they're seeing down in Australia. Well, let's turn away from these heavier topics and talk about something more fun. And what could be more fun than talking about flying cars? So we seem to have a never-ending stream of flying car stories. This one applies to a pretty solid company that's been around a long time. From Flying Magazine, the Volvo parent company in China is apparently acquiring flying car maker Terrafugia. You may remember that a couple of grads from MIT about a decade ago started Terrafugia, and on the Airplane Geek show, we interviewed Carl Dietrich, and I've met Carl, and we've talked in the past. They have a marvelous car, which they have displayed at Oshkosh a number of times. And the South China News has reported that Geely, that's Geely, the company that also owns Volvo, has agreed to acquire Terrafugia. Reports indicate that they were particularly interested in the FAA's approval last year, which allows this flying car to be certified as a light sport aircraft. They were granted an exemption that meant they legally could weigh up to 1,800 pounds, which is significantly more than most light sport aircraft. The Terrafugia's Transition test vehicle claims a range of 400 nautical miles at a top speed of about 90 knots. The Transition's wings also fold back to allow the aircraft to fit into a standard single-car garage. So they also have a separate product called the TFX, which they're developing that'll use ducted fans for vertical lift like a helicopter to supplement the standard 300 horsepower engine. The purchase price for Terrafugia was not announced. And it looks like it may be finally the end of the road for one of the most famous flying car projects in history. From TheVerge.com, you can now buy the Moller Skycar, one of the world's most iconic and dubious flying cars. Anyone can fly the Skycar, said the headline back in the January 1991 cover of Popular Mechanics magazine. Now, that dream just never really came to fruition, even though the company spent reportedly over $100 million, and the owner himself went through personal bankruptcy in 2009. They say that the Skycar combined the high-speed capabilities of fixed-wing aircraft with the vertical takeoff and landing capabilities of a helicopter. Its ducted fans provided lift and propulsion without the dangers of exposed rotor blades and the high-maintenance cost of rotary wing aircraft. These were all the brainchild of Professor Paul Moller, 80 years old, professor emeritus at the University of California at Davis, and also considered to be the world's most preeminent flying car enthusiast. And for more than 40 years, he preached the gospel of VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing, claiming that we would all have personal road-ready aircraft parked in our garages in the future. And he sought to make this Jetson-like vision of the future come true through sheer force of will. But none of these vehicles ended up flying for any sustained time, and now many consider Moller to be a charlatan. Back in 2003, the Securities and Exchange Commission went after him for issuing fraudulent stock. And in 2013, he launched a crowdfunding campaign to get his flying car off the ground, but only raised 3% of his stated goal. As I said earlier, he went through $100 million developing the design and declared personal bankruptcy. Well, you can now get that one copy of the Moller Skycar by going on to eBay. Minimum bid, $1 million. But of course, you can also use the buy it now option and get this little piece of history for just $5 million. In experimental news, this comes from kitplanes.com. The author writes, I recently got a call from Van's Aircraft saying they had something I really needed to see. So he flew on up there. And in Kit Planes, he shows pictures of what he says are the latest project in Van's prototype shop. He says it's still a bit rough, but they hope to have it painted by the time Oshkosh rolls around. So he goes on and says, I didn't ask them which Oshkosh, so it might not be there this year. He says performance numbers are still a mystery. The cockpit, he says, is Spartan and form-fitting. It has the legroom of the RV3, but the width of the RV1. He says without upholstery, the view over the nose appears to be adequate. Ryan Johnson, Van's chief engineer, is hoping to have an engine installed very soon and promised that when it flies, Kit Planes will get a crack at evaluating the aircraft. So, sounds like there is something new being cooked up at Van's. And from AOPA, this is going to be relevant to anybody flying in Southern California in the high desert adjacent to Arizona. The FAA activates a temporary restricted area despite objections. And according to AOPA, the FAA has published a final rule that establishes 3 temporary restricted areas near the 29 Palms, California area in support of a large-scale Marine Corps exercise scheduled for August 7th through the 26th, so most of the month of August. Now, AOPA has long objected to the use of temporary restricted areas to support military exercises and has caused for a moratorium on their use, noting that this temporary airspace is uncharted and creates an unacceptable flight hazard to general aviation pilots. They say the publication's pilots customarily consult for flight safety do not describe these rarely used temporary special use airspace, creating a gap in pilots' ability to assess a flight's risk. And Rune Duke, AOPA's Director of Airspace and Air Traffic, says temporary restricted areas have not been used for 20 years. Now, the NOTAM, which is issued for this temporary restricted area, will use the word tempo, but it will not include a description of where a pilot can find the airspace. The temporary airspace will be graphically depicted on the FAA's Special Use Airspace website and in the NOTAMs to Airmen publication. So, as you can imagine, outreach to pilots is a high priority for AOPA to let everybody know about this temporary restricted area. So if you're going to be flying in Southern California, and by the way, I looked at the map, this goes as far east as over Lake Havasu on the Arizona border. You want to be very careful about this temporary restricted area. Turning now to international news, this comes from aeronews.net. From our neighbors to the north, Canada, Solar Ship celebrates the Canadian 150th birthday and demonstrates fossil fuel-free flight for Canada's north. Now, this is a really fascinating story about the Solar Ship, which is built by the DRDC, the Defense Research and Development of Canada. When you look at this project, it basically looks like kind of a small blimp, if you will, and apparently the solar power is being used to drive the engines on it. And they've got a series of different size vehicles starting from a fairly small one to some really large ones. The largest one they envision will carry up to around 60,000 pounds. And this originally came out of an idea for providing heavy lift capabilities for Africa to try and provide transportation in some of the remote areas there. But they're also looking at it as a way to provide support for the northern part of Canada. And they point out that, with current warming of the climate, that the ice road transportation system may not work that well in the future. And this might be a lower cost way of being able to continue to transport goods into the northern part of Canada. So if you get a chance, you can go out and take a look at this. I'll post a link on our Patreon page. Rather interesting vehicle. And from Australia, which has the largest number of listeners to this podcast outside the United States, this comes to us from aeronews.net again. Pilatus hands over the 1500th PC-12 to the Royal Flying Doctor Service of Australia. As part of the celebration at their headquarters in Stans, Pilatus handed over the keys to the 1500th PC-12 to the Royal Flying Doctor Service of Australia. They said this was a fitting milestone in the history of the Pilatus PC-12. Turns out that back in 1994, the RFDS was among the first customers to take delivery of a PC-12, and this really shocked me. They currently use 33 PC-12s to provide medical assistance to people living in remote areas across the continent. And the RFDS transports around 18,000 patients yearly, operating in and out of short and unmade bush strips, which they say are ideal terrain for the PC-12. Their CEO, John Lynch, said, "We are very proud of our partnership with Pilatus and would like to say how honored we are to accept this anniversary PC-12 today." He said the PC-12 is perfectly tailored to the rigorous conditions in the Australian outback. We appreciate its special characteristics and recognize the indispensable role it plays in enabling us to meet the challenges of our mission as it is defined today. And there was a marvelous television show that ran for many years in Europe that was about the Royal Flying Doctor Service. I don't know that it was ever shown here in the United States, but I enjoyed seeing some of those shows when I was overseas. And finally, to wrap things up from General Aviation News, teachers field test an aviation curriculum. This comes out of a program that AOPA has set up called You Can Fly High School Aviation Initiative to try and create aviation-based science, technology, and engineering and math, that's STEM, curriculum for high school students around the country. Now, there were a number of educators that were in visiting AOPA headquarters back in late June to test this program. Curriculum is introducing as a workshop that they say is part of a first-of-a-kind program to offer students comprehensive four-year aviation study options. Approximately 30 schools are going to test this ninth grade curriculum in the coming year. Now, according to Cindy Hasselbring, she's the senior director of AOPA's You Can Fly High School initiative. She says the initial courses will then become available for any high school to implement in the fall of 2018. And it says here they're going to have 3 career and technical education paths. So that would include ones for people who want to become pilots, work with unmanned aircraft systems, or to work in aerospace engineering. And this curriculum is funded by donors to the AOPA Foundation. Sounds like a great program for educators everywhere. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up in a moment, we're going to talk about that mysterious squelch control you find on radios and intercoms, and also talk about understanding older audio panels. Plus, listener letters. One listener asked whether he should still dive and drive when flying a non-precision instrument approach. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Before I get to talking about squelch controls and audio panels, just a few quick announcements. I am headed down to El Paso, Texas on Friday. I'll be picking up a Cessna 206 with someone who's just purchased it. We're going to be coming back through Scottsdale since he has a short meeting there. Now, originally, I had planned to do this trip 3 weeks ago, but you may recall that's when that heat wave was sweeping the Southwest. Temperatures were predicted to be 113 in El Paso and 116 in Scottsdale. It's going to be at least 10 degrees cooler this week. So I'm looking forward to this trip with a new owner. And as I mentioned last week, we're going to have a special joke show with Rob Mark in August. That is, if you send me some jokes. Nobody sent in any last week, so I'm starting to wonder, are we going to do this show? So you have the whole month of July. Go ahead and go to aviationnewstalk.com/contact, or you can click on the contact button at the top of the show. Send me your favorite jokes, because we want to have some fun. And thanks to everybody who has been filling out surveys for me. The new survey is up, and it asks, what airplane do you fly most, and what aircraft do you plan to check out in next? And by the way, I added one extra question to the end, which is, what topics would you like to hear about on this show? And I've already had a couple of good ideas come through that. So go to aviationnewstalk.com/survey. Tell me what aircraft you fly most. And I want to give a big special thank you to the 7 new people who are supporting me on the Patreon page, which I started about 10 days ago. So we've got 9 supporters total. The most recent ones are Indy, Chris Miller, Evan Doss, C. Scott Tabbitt, Ken Mercer, Jan Squillis, and Michael Ellis. Thanks so much. If you go out to that page, you're going to see the amazing pictures I've just posted of the Canadian solar ship, which I talked about in the news. And also you can read about some of the goals I've set there. Let's try and get this first goal knocked out in the month of July. I'd like to go ahead and get up to the $100 a month level to help pay back all of the money I've spent on equipment, software, and web service fees, because then what I really want to get to is the next goal, which is where I'm going to go ahead and order up some podcast apps so that people can actually find us in the iTunes store or in the Google Play Store. And that's going to be a great way for non-techies to find the show and to listen to it. So go ahead, go out to my Patreon page. You can find it by going to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, or you can also find it by going to aviationnewstalk.com and clicking on Help the Show at the top of the page. And of course, I didn't mention last week, but I also have online courses. Just go out to pilotlearning.com. I've got courses on the G1000, on WASA GPSs, and the courses range from $59 to $79, or you can take all of them. I saw someone just signed up here a few minutes ago for the low monthly membership of $29.95, or you can get a full membership for $2.99, and if you do that, you'll also get a half-hour consulting call with me to talk about whatever you like. So stick around, because in 7 seconds, we are back with Squelch controls and audio panels. Welcome back. Before we get into the gear, I want to talk first about radio communications in general, because at some point or another, it seems that everyone has had some trouble with radio communications or with using the equipment so that they can talk on the radio. And for student pilots and low-time pilots, I would say an excellent way to get really good at radio communications is to listen over the internet, or to a handheld radio if you have one, to other airplanes talking with ATC. An easy way to do that over the internet is go to liveatc.net and put in your airport or the name of the approach control that you'd like to listen to for a major airport, and then just sit and listen to the chatter that goes on. So even if it's not your airport that you're listening to, you can learn a lot just by listening over the internet to a tower or approach controller sending traffic to a medium or large size airport. Now, I wanted to talk first about equipment. So let's talk about audio panels. So, for example, the ones that are found in the 1960s through 1980s, Cessnas and Pipers, and probably most of the GA aircraft at that time. I just was exchanging email with one of my new patron sponsors, Michael, who was telling me that he was on his solo cross-country flight, and it was going to be a long one, 3 hours, and he said that he thought his radio wasn't working, and he thought he was going to have to turn around, but eventually he figured out that the automatic switch on his audio panel was in the wrong position. That told me immediately it was one of these older 1960s through 1980s audio panels. The newer systems have a different setup. But let's talk about the automatic switch, because I know it was confusing to me the first time that I came across it. What it does is it automatically associates the receiver with the position of your transmit knob. So let's talk about the transmit knob. On these older audio panels, it's usually all the way on the right-hand side, and it's often the only knob on the audio panel. And all it does is it switches the microphone you're talking through from COM 1 to COM 2. So when you switch to COM 1, it connects your microphone to COM 1. Now, if you use the automatic switch, It will automatically set your receiver to COM 1 when you're set to transmit on COM 1, and when the transmit knob is set to COM 2, it'll automatically select the receiver for COM 2, which makes it very convenient and handy as long as that switch is in the right position. Now, if the automatic switch is in the up position, you're going to hear the selected radio on the overhead speaker. If the automatic switch is in the down position, then you're going to hear it on your headset. And if it's in the middle, well, there's no automatic switching of the receiver at all. In fact, if all of those switches, including automatic, are in the middle, you are not going to hear anything at all. So you want to make sure that automatic switch is probably most likely down so that you can hear the receiver for the radio you're talking to on your headset. Now, on these audio panels, you're also going to find a lot of other small silver 3-position switches for each of the devices in the aircraft that you could listen to. So for sure, that's going to be both COM radios, it's going to be both nav radios, and then if you've got other equipment like a DME or an ADF, you're going to have switches for those too. And to listen to any of these items, just push the silver switch up to hear it through the overhead speaker or push it down to hear it through your headset. But most of the time, all those little switches are going to be in the middle position and the automatic switch is going to be in the down position. And that's the way most people end up using this older audio panel. Now, the newer audio panels I'm not going to talk about. They're a little bit easier to understand. Now let's talk about another subject that confuses people, which is squelch. And I hear people talk about it all the time, and I can tell that they don't really know the details of it. Fortunately, I'm a ham radio operator and an electrical engineer, and so squelch is pretty familiar to me. Squelch is incredibly simple. It's just an electronic circuit that turns off the audio output, which is the volume that you're listening to, when the signal that's being received falls below a certain level. So what that basically means is if you're listening to a strong signal on your radio, you hear it. If there's a very weak signal on your radio, you don't hear it at all because it falls below the threshold below which the receiver will turn on the speaker. So basically what it does is it sets it up so that you will never hear just raw background noise. If there's raw background noise, boom, the receiver turns that off. You don't hear the background noise, and you also don't hear very weak signals in that background noise either, which, by the way, is really handy if you, for example, are listening to the ATC and you're 30 miles away and the ATC is just barely coming in. It's chopping in and out. That's because it's a weak signal, and for a second or two, it'll be strong enough to open the squelch, and then it will be so weak that the squelch closes. So you hear the signal chopping in, chopping out. Well, a nice technique is just turn the squelch off, and then you will be able to hear, once that signal starts chopping in and out, the entire ATC perfectly, because when squelch is off, you hear everything. You hear the background noise, you hear the weak signal, and it's handy sometimes just to turn the squelch off if you do want to listen to a weak signal. Now, on older receivers, you're going to see two knobs. One is a volume knob and the other is a squelch knob. And you can actually adjust the squelch continuously. So you can set the threshold where it turns the audio on and off. And the way you want to set it generally is you turn that knob counterclockwise and you hear lots of noise, and then you slowly turn it clockwise, and when you just get to the point where the noise goes away, that's where you leave it. Now you've set the squelch for the most sensitive setting so that you'll hear the weakest possible signals, but of course there will be some signals you won't be able to hear. And if that's the case, just grab that little knob, turn it a little bit counterclockwise. That will open up the squelch, and then you'll be able to hear those weak signals. Now on newer, more modern comm radios, they don't have a squelch knob. You can't actually adjust the squelch setting. All you can do is turn the squelch on and off. So for example, on the Garmin G1000, and also, for example, on Garmin 430 and 530 receivers, there's going to be a volume knob, and when you push that volume knob, it's going to turn the squelch off, and so then you'll hear all the background noise and any weak signals. Push it again, and now the squelch is turned on. So little differences in terms of way you would set squelch on older versus newer receivers. And just to make things a little bit more confusing, there's also a squelch circuit that's part of the intercom system. Now, the intercom is totally separate from all the radios that you transmit on. Those people can hear you over the air broadcasting. With the intercom, only people inside the airplane can hear what you're talking about. So older airplanes often have had intercoms added to them. It might be part of the audio panel, or it might be a separate device. At a minimum, it's going to allow two people to talk with each other, usually the pilot and the co-pilot, but most aircraft are also set up so that everybody can talk with each other over this internal loop, which is created by the intercom system. Now, the intercom systems have volume knobs and squelch knobs, and often they can be set individually for each microphone, or at least for some subset of the microphone. So common panel is going to have a pair of concentric knobs on the left, which the outer knob is going to set the squelch for the pilot. The inner knob is going to set the volume of what the pilot hears over the intercom in his headset. And the same thing is going to be on the right side of the panel. You're going to have an outer concentric knob that sets the squelch setting for the co-pilot's microphone, and then an inner knob which sets the volume of the intercom in his ears. So that's the level at which he hears other people talking in the aircraft. And sometimes the passengers will also be part of that second set of knobs. So all three of those people will have the same settings. Now, the squelch works differently in the intercom than it does in the radio, so the principle is more or less the same. In the comm radios, it's turning the output, the volume that you're listening to, on and off. But in the intercom system, it's essentially turning the microphones on and off. So the output of this intercom doesn't go away. So in other words, if one person is talking, other microphones can be squelched and you still hear audio output from the intercom. It's just certain microphones are being switched off by the squelch system. Now, when everything is quiet, all microphones are turned off by the squelch setting. When one person talks, just their microphone is opened up so that what they are saying can now be heard over the intercom system. Now, when I get into aircraft, I often find that the intercom is set incorrectly for the squelch, and I'll find that pilots are, trying to set it, but they don't know how to set it correctly. Here's how you know if your intercom is not set correctly. If, when you're quiet, you hear continuous background noise, the squelch is open on the microphone, it's not sensitive enough, and so all the noise is being passed through on at least one of the microphones, maybe all of the microphones connected to the audio panel. Or if, when you start talking, your first syllables are clipped. So in other words, you start to talk, but the first syllable or two doesn't come through on the intercom. Well, then the squelch is set too tightly. It's turned too far clockwise, and so it's clipping the beginning of every sentence that you speak. Now, often I'll see people trying to set the squelch. They have their hand on the knob, they're turning it continuously, and they're going check, 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 check. And that is just the worst possible way to set the squelch. Usually what happens is they end up set with the squelch too far counterclockwise. It's open continuously. There's background noise that they're not noticing. But since they can hear themselves continuously, they figure, hey, it must be set correctly. No, it's not. Ironically, the best way to set it is just the opposite way. You want to be very, very quiet. So what I would do is I would first turn the volume knob up on the intercom so that I can hear the background noise really, really clearly. And then without saying anything, I'm going to turn the squelch knob counterclockwise until I'm sure I hear lots of background noise. Once I hear that noise, then start to turn that knob clockwise till the noise just goes away. When you get to the point where, yeah, I heard noise, now I don't hear noise, that's where you want to leave the squelch knob. That's the optimal setting for your intercom panel. Do that for both the microphones, both for the pilot and for the co-pilot if you have two squelch knobs on your intercom or audio panel. Now, you may find that after you take off, the background noise from the engine is going to be louder, and that might actually turn your mic on, and once again, you're going to hear background noise. If that's the case, take the squelch knob and turn it just a little tiny bit further clockwise, and then once again, you'll be at the point where the background noise goes away. And if you fly the same plane often, you'll probably recognize how much you have to set it when you take off, when the noise gets louder. If that's the case, when you're initially setting it on the ground, just go a little bit past the point where the noise goes away. Keep turning clockwise a little bit further, and that'll take care of the fact that you're going to need a slightly higher setting in the air than you're going to need on the ground. Well, I hope that cleared up some of the mysteries surrounding squelch settings both on your comm radio and on your intercom, and that it helps you with your flying. Coming up, we have listener feedback on whether that thing in your wallet, well, is it a pilot certificate or a pilot license? And a listener asked whether he should be diving and driving while flying an instrument approach. And a future CFI wants to know, hey, how come it's so hard to land from the right seat? I'll talk about that and more. We'll be right back. And a quick tip of the hat to the Plane Talking UK podcast. I was a guest on episode 172, had a great time talking with Carlos and Matt. So check that out at Plane Talking UK. And also wanted to thank everybody who left iTunes reviews in the Canadian store. Spicy Rice Tea, who tells us he's a flight attendant working on his private pilot's license, left a review. Thanks so much for that. Also had 3 different reviews in the UK. So Dean333, Carlos UK, and Army UK. Thanks so much for all your reviews. And I'm going to read just one of them. This one comes from Germany, and it's from EXQHF. And the title of the review is Sehr empfehlenswert, which is highly recommended. And the review reads, Schöne Podcast, kurzweilig, immer interessante Themen. So, beautiful podcast, entertaining, always interesting topics. Thanks for that review. And moving on to listener feedback, Steve from Denver, who is an airline pilot, wrote, you recently commented on listener feedback asking why the U.S. uses the term airman certification versus licensing. And he says certification is the term the FAA chose because the U.S. aviation system is based entirely on certification. Things and people that work within the system are all subject to some form of certification. Airports and navigation facilities, aircraft, airlines, avionics, and the list goes on, all are certified. And then he says the term airman is a catch-all that you see applied to both pilots and others who work within the system. Flight engineers, mechanics, dispatchers, and others are also referred to as airmen on their application for certification. Thanks for that, Steve. And Stefan from Syracuse says, Max, thank you for the ATC privatization episode. Well done, and unfortunately, absolutely necessary. He says, besides the U.S., I have flown general aviation in Switzerland, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. And he says the main impact that he has noticed in these countries are no private instrument ratings. It's simply too expensive, so hopefully people simply don't fly when the weather goes bad. And he says noticeably lower pilot proficiency in general. The excessive cost means that nobody gets enough proficiency. And I guess by that he means people can't afford to practice lots of landings if it's costing them, $7 and $10 a landing.
Hi, this is Rick from Ohio. I have a quick question about becoming a CFI. I'm interested in making that transition. However, I'm having difficulty transitioning to flying from the right seat. Actually, my landings vary from horrible to almost terrifying, more so than when I first was learning to fly. Any tips or suggestions on making the transition from left seat to right seat would really help me out. Thanks, Max.
Great question, Rick. I'm glad to see that I'm not the only one who had great difficulty transitioning into the right seat. First, I think transitioning to the right seat for most people is non-trivial. Yeah, there may be a few supermen among us who do it with no problem, but I frankly found it terrifying at first, and I probably had over 700 total hours, maybe 800 when I got my CFI. First, don't do what I did. Here I am confessing. I was cheap. I didn't want to pay a flight instructor, so I thought I would teach myself to fly from the right wing. And man, that was a big mistake, and I would highly discourage doing that. Now, what I found, and what you probably found, is taking off in the right seat, easy. Flying in cruise, easy. Landing, terrifying. Now, I think the problem is that the view out the window is different. And I think part of the reason is it's just a little bit more difficult to tell when the wings are level as you get close to the ground. I mean, it's easy to tell when they're level in flight, but I think that when you get down close to the ground, it's very disorienting because the curvature of the window is different, and so the view of what you see out the front is different. I now find it equally easy to land from the left or the right, but those first few hours landing in the right, they're very difficult for most people. So here's what I would do. Hire a CFI and have him or her sit in the left seat. Then have him or her make a couple of landings from the left seat while you're watching from the right. And what you see will not look right, but you have to take it on faith that it is. And if you want, I'd suggest you have your hands very lightly on the controls to follow along as the CFI is landing. Then, with the CFI still on board, start making the landings yourself from the right seat and try to make the view out the window match what you saw when the CFI did the first few demo landings. Now, you're going to be the primary mover of the controls at this point, and the CFI is very lightly following along and coaching you in the process. So he or she might be saying more left rudder, or I actually will say more left foot, just so there's no doubt in people's mind as to, what they should be using. Or I'll often say more right wing, and that kind of means lower the right wing some more. If you do 2 flights like this and do a total of 20 landings, I think you'll start getting more comfortable with flying from the right seat and then may be able to practice this on your own. By the way, I remember coming back from one of my first few flights trying to practice, and a flight instructor had reported to the club manager that there was somebody flying an airplane from the right seat and their landings were very flat. And I thought about it and I thought, wow, you're right. I hadn't even noticed it. As I was practicing, I was making very flat landings. I didn't have the nose up as I touched down. So, it really helps to have somebody there to coach you along through the process.
Hello, Max. This is Ruben from the Netherlands. What is the common practice in the US to conduct non-precision approaches? In Europe and Australia, as far as I'm being taught, they recommend nowadays to perform CDFA approaches, constant descent final approaches, whenever you have a non-precision approach with distance measuring, so like a VOR DME, localizer DME, or GNSS approach, instead of the dive and drive methodology of descending to the MDA at a higher rate of descent and then maintaining that MDA until the missed approach point. I'm being taught to do the CDFA approach, and they Jeppesen plates, they nowadays state decision altitudes for non-precision approaches. It kind of says DA/MDA, and at that DA if there's no contact with the runway environment, we conduct a missed approach. Is this similar in the US? Just out of interest. Thanks again for your podcast. I love it. And have a nice day.
Ruben, I've actually written on this subject in a couple different places. I just pulled up an article that I wrote for the AOPA blog back in 2013, and it also includes a quote in my Max Trescott's GPS and WAAS instrument flying handbook regarding non-precision approaches. So what I want to tell you is that diving and driving on instrument approaches is dead, and so are some of the pilots who used to fly this way. Now, I'm sure there are probably a few CFIs right now going, huh? Really? I still teach dive and drive. Let's talk about why that is now an outdated practice. In the bad old days of dive and drive, we were often flying, for example, NDB approaches or VOR approaches that were very inaccurate. One corporate pilot told me that he used to feel lucky to be within half a mile of an airport when he was flying an NDB approach, and he had to look pretty much from his 9 o'clock position to his 3 o'clock position to find the airport at minimums. In those days, the advantage of dive and drive was it got you down to minimums early, so you could start looking for that airport, which could be anywhere in front of you. Could be way off to the left, could be way off to the right. These days, certainly VOR approaches are more accurate than NDB approaches. GPS approaches are incredibly accurate. I don't know what your experience is, but mine has been these days when I fly an instrument approach and I look up, the runway is right there in front of me. I mean, it's at 12 o'clock. So the advantage of getting down early to find the airport is no longer necessary, which is why we don't have to dive and drive anymore. The disadvantage of dive and drive, as I mentioned in my article, was people were getting killed. It's not surprising that if you have a high descent rate, that can cause a pilot to inadvertently lose control or fail to level off at the proper altitude. And quoting from my GPS and WAAS book, in 2001, the FAA announced that the industry should discontinue the use of a dive and drive process on non-precision approach procedures since they contribute to CFIT, controlled flight into terrain accidents, the leading cause of fatal commercial air accidents worldwide. Instead, the FAA advocates the use of procedures and training for a stabilized, continuous descent on non-precision approaches. Some airlines have gone so far as to implement procedures that require pilots to immediately initiate a missed approach if they don't see the airport when they reach the MDA. They are not permitted to continue driving to the missed approach point. And if you'd like to get a copy of that book in the U.S., call 800-247-6553 and ask for Max Trescott's GPS and WAAS Instrument Flying Handbook. And finally, here's a listener question from Andy, and I'm guessing he's in the Gulf region, somewhere around Texas or perhaps Louisiana. He writes, I had some friends in for the weekend, and they had never been flying in a small plane before. We went out for a city tour and came back and got a little low around the bayous for sunset. A couple of days later, when I was thinking about the flight and how nice it was, it dawned on me, I hope that wasn't a wildlife refuge. He says, I'm somewhat new to the area. Sure enough, I checked my sectional, and it was. I was well below 2,000 feet and remembered being taught that I cannot go below that altitude. I decided to do a little research before self-reporting and found that it is requested that you stay above 2,000 feet and that there is no actual FARs governing this. I can't find it in black and white that I actually broke any regulations. Do you have any advice on this matter? Well, Andy, I can't pretend to give you any legal advice, and I certainly won't. That would be malpractice, just as anybody who's trying to teach you how to fly who doesn't have a flight instructor rating. They, too, would be committing malpractice, and of course the regs prevent people from teaching who don't have a flight instructor rating. Yes, it does sound like if you wanted to really be as cautious as possible, you might want to file that NASA form. And beyond that, I'm not sure what advice I would give you other than, to check charts more carefully before you fly in areas that you're not as familiar with. I can tell you that along the coast here in California, a number of people have gotten in trouble for some odd reasons. So we too have for years had the flight below 2,000 feet not recommended for large sections of the coast of California. And of course, that doesn't say you can't fly below 2,000 feet. However, there has been a state law in many sections of the coast that you cannot fly below 1,000 feet. And I know in case in point from a friend of mine that worked at the FAA that there was a helicopter that was filming the Big Sur race, and they got below 1,000 feet, and they were violated. And when it went to court, the FAA actually testified on behalf of the helicopter pilot saying, well, it's not marked anywhere on the charts, the sectional charts you would get from the government, and therefore that the pilot should not be held responsible. Well, guess what? Pilot lost. My understanding is it cost him over $10,000. And so it's pretty simple. Even if there are state laws and they're not marked on the charts, you can still get in trouble. Now, I think recently they have finally added those areas on the California coast, and it finally shows where the state law prevents you from flying below 1,000 feet. But as a general rule, I never fly 1,000 feet below the beaches because a couple of years ago, there was an article in AOPA magazine about a case in which the FAA held that by definition, all beaches are congested areas. And so basically they violated a CFI near Eureka, California. It was the middle of the winter. There's nobody on the beach. He was below 1,000 feet. And they violated him because not that he was close to a person, but because he was less than 1,000 feet over a beach. So it just doesn't pay to fly low unless you really know all the details about where you're flying. And if there are any aviation attorneys listening, go ahead and contact me, pass along your advice, and we'll pass it along on the show. And that wraps it up for this show. Be sure to come back on Friday for our special Newsmakers edition on the 70th anniversary of the Beechcraft Bonanza and the 50th anniversary of the American Bonanza Society. And if you have a question you'd like answered, go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Listener Question at the top of the page so that you can record a question. Also, please help me get to my first Patreon goal of $100 a month before the end of July. Just type into your web browser aviationnewstalk.com/awesome because you're awesome listeners and make a contribution. And if you're thinking of buying a new or slightly used Cirrus aircraft, please contact me early in the process so I can help you with the decision as to whether to buy new or used. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the country. If you love the show, please tell your friends. And also check out the online courses I have available at pilotlearning.com. In the meantime, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.